There's a kind of cold that settles into a frontier town come February. Not the dramatic cold of blizzards that make the papers back east, but the quiet kind. The kind that seeps through chinked walls and burrows into floorboards and makes a body forget what warmth ever felt like. Prescott, Arizona territory, wore that cold like a second skin in the winter of 1883. Frost lacquered the hitching posts along Gurley Street. Wood smoke hung low over the rooftops, too heavy to rise, and the last blue light of dusk turned the snow into something that looked almost beautiful if you didn't have to live in it. The smell of lye soap and wet wool hung inside the shanty at the edge of town, a place no bigger than a horse stall. Past where the boardwalk ended and the mud began. One room, one window, one stove that coughed thin smoke into a room that never quite got warm enough to take your shawl off. The laundry line strung out back had frozen stiff, and the sheets hung like ghosts that had given up haunting. Opal Kincaid stood at her table, if you could call a plank on 2 barrels, a table counting pennies. 14 cents for a full day's washing. Her hands were cracked at the knuckles. The skin split along the lines where her fingers bent, and she moved them the way an old woman moves, careful, slow, aware of every joint. She was barely 30. She'd buried a husband in Colorado, walked to Arizona territory on her own 2 feet, and hadn't asked a soul for help since. She ladled broth into a tin bowl. Thin stuff, more water than anything, with a heel of bread gone hard enough to tap against the table. The smell of it, weak as it was, made her stomach clench and her hands shake just slightly. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's cold biscuit. She looked at the bowl. She looked at the door. Then she divided it. Half the bread broke into pieces. Half the broth poured into a second dish. Chipped at the rim, she pulled her shawl tight, pushed open the door, and knelt in the snow beside her step. They were already waiting. 3 dogs, a brown mutt with a torn ear, a skinny hound with ribs like a washboard, and a little black thing no bigger than a boot, shivering so hard its whole body blurred. 2 barn cats sat farther back, patient and watchful, the sound of them eating quick, desperate. Grateful was the only noise on the edge of Prescott that evening. Opal set the dishes down and pressed her hand against her stomach, where the hunger sat like a stone. The dogs came forward careful, the way strays do when they've been kicked more than fed. She watched them eat and felt the dizziness swim up behind her eyes, the kind that comes when you stand too fast on an empty belly. She waited for it to pass. It always passed. "Go on now," she whispered to the little black one. "Eat up. Ain't nobody gonna take it from you." Behind her, the stove coughed its thin smoke into the February sky. The smell of lye and loneliness drifted through the open door. Her own supper sat cooling on the plank inside half a bowl of broth, and nothing else. She didn't see the horseman who had stopped on the road. She didn't see him remove his hat and hold it against his chest like a man standing over something sacred. Asa Whitfield had been riding the same road home for 11 years and had never once stopped on it. Not for weather, not for trouble, not for anything short of a lame horse. A man with 800 head of cattle and 42 sections of land didn't stop for much. He had a cook who served supper at 6, a foreman who ran the hands, and a house big enough to echo when he walked through it. The house had echoed for 2 years now, since Clara died. He'd been in town settling a feed bill when he turned his horse onto the Prescott road and saw her. A woman kneeling in the snow at the edge of that sorry little shanty, her shawl pulled around her shoulders like it could do any good against this cold. She was splitting her supper, what little there was of it, between 3 shivering mutts, who looked like they hadn't seen a square meal since autumn. Asa pulled his horse up. He didn't plan to. Something about the way she moved, careful and unhurried, like feeding these animals, was the most important work she'd do all day. Like it mattered more than the cold, more than her own hunger, more than anything else left in her life. His hand went to his hat and took it off before he'd thought about it. He hadn't made that gesture for a living person in 2 years. "Ma'am," he said quiet. She looked up, startled. Snow in her hair, hands red as raw beef. She leaned back on her heels, and her fingers curled around the edge of her shawl, the way a person grips a railing when the ground shifts, holding on to whatever dignity she could reach. "A woman who feeds creatures that can't pay her back," Asa said, "has got the richest heart in this territory." Color flooded her face. She looked down at the dogs, then back at him. "They're hungry, is all. So's my ranch house." He turned his hat in his hands. "My cook serves supper at 6, and my table's got room for someone who knows what kindness means." She didn't answer. Her hand found the door frame of the shanty behind her and held it, steadying herself, and her eyes moved to the road home as if calculating the cost of every kindness she'd ever accepted and what had been demanded in return. Asa put his hat back on and nudged his horse forward. He didn't press, didn't wait. A woman like that, you left the door open and trusted her to walk through it on her own terms. He glanced back once from the bend. She'd already turned back to the dogs. He thought she didn't even hesitate to give it away. Pride's a funny thing on the frontier. It'll keep you warm for exactly 1 night before it turns to ash. Opal stood in her shanty that evening, looking at her cold stove, her empty cupboard, the frost climbing the inside of her one window. The strays had curled up against the outside wall, where the stovepipe gave off what little heat it could. She could hear the little black dog whimpering in its sleep. She thought about the rancher's face. No pity in it. That was the thing. The last man who'd offered her help was a shopkeeper in Trinidad, Colorado, who'd given her credit for 3 months' groceries and then showed up at her door one night, expecting payment of a different kind. She'd left Trinidad the next morning with nothing but her shoes, and a lesson she'd carved into bone: nothing is free. But this man had looked at her the way you look at something you admire, like she'd done something fine instead of something desperate. Her stomach cramped hard enough to bend her forward. She pressed her fist against it and breathed through her nose and made a decision. The walk to the Whitfield ranch took 20 minutes in the cold. By the time she reached the porch, her feet were numb and her pride was fighting a losing battle against the smell coming through the door. Beef and onions, biscuits browning, coffee so strong and dark the scent alone could wake the dead. A round-faced Mexican woman opened the door before Opal could knock. "You must be the one Senor Whitfield mentioned. Come, sit." Dolores, that was her name, had flour on her apron and warmth in her voice, and not a single pitying glance in her eyes. The table was enormous. 12 chairs. Only Asa at the head, looking up from his plate with a nod that said everything and nothing. Opal sat, and the first bite of beef hit her tongue, and she had to close her eyes. The warmth of it spread through her chest like whiskey. loosening something she'd held clenched for months. She ate slowly, carefully, with the kind of dignity that poverty and hunger and loneliness hadn't managed to strip from her. Asa asked her nothing, not where she came from, not how she'd ended up in that shanty, not a single question that would have cost her pride to answer. They talked about the weather, about the price of feed, about nothing at all, really, about everything that mattered, walking home in the dark, the cold biting through her shawl. Opal heard a sound from the barn, a calf, bawling high and desperate, the way they do when they can't find their mother. She stopped. She looked toward the road home. She looked at the barn. She went to the barn. The calf was a week old, maybe less. Its mother had died birthing it, and nobody had taken the time to bottle feed it proper. Opal knelt in the straw that smelled of hay and manure and animal warmth and held the calf's head and said the same thing she said to the strays. "Shh now, I got you." Come dawn, she was back. Dolores watched from the kitchen window and set a second plate without being asked. Over the next week, Asa watched his ranch change in ways he couldn't quite name. It started small. Opal arrived each morning before the hands were up, going straight to the barn where the orphan calf she'd named it Button was gaining weight by the day. She had a way with animals that bordered on something Asa had no word for. Not miraculous, exactly. More like she spoke a language the rest of them had forgotten. Horses that spooked at shadows stood calm under her hand. The barn cats, half wild and suspicious of everyone, followed her like she trailed cream behind her. But it was the ranch hands who surprised Asa most. Coop, his foreman, a man built like a fence post, and about as talkative, found Asa by the corral one afternoon, and said something Asa had never heard him say about anyone in 11 years of working together. "That woman's got a way about her, boss. Even the horses know it." It was true. The bunkhouse smelled different sage and dried winter wildflower sprigs that Opal had placed in a tin can on the windowsill. Such a small thing. Flowers in a tin can. But young Jesse Pruitt paused beside it every morning now, touching a dried petal with a calloused finger, like he was reminding himself something gentle still existed. He'd started wiping his boots before coming inside. Old Martin stopped spitting tobacco on the barn floor. Asa stood in the barn doorway one afternoon, watching Opal calm a panicked mare that had cut her leg on fence wire. No rope, no force, just her voice, low and steady as water over stone, and her hands moving slow. 3 ranch hands stood behind her, hats off, watching, learning something no man had thought to teach them. The mare's breathing slowed. Her eyes stopped rolling. She stood still and let Opal clean the wound. That evening, Asa found himself adding a cushion to Opal's chair at the supper table. He stood there with his hand on the worn fabric, the smell of Dolores's coffee drifting from the kitchen, and he was aware painfully, precisely aware of what the gesture meant. He set it down and walked away before he could think about it further. In town that same day, Mrs. Harlan, the dry goods merchant's wife, watched Opal walking toward the Whitfield ranch and leaned across the counter to Mrs. Pruitt. Her voice carried the particular sweetness of a woman sharpening a knife. "You see that every morning now, walking up to that big house like she belongs there." Mrs. Pruitt clucked her tongue. "A woman in her position ought to know better." The words floated through Prescott like wood smoke. They hadn't reached Opal yet. But smoke always rises, and words always travel, and in a town this small, nothing stays secret past Sunday. They reached her on a Tuesday. Opal went to town for lye soap and washing soda she still took in laundry, still earned her pennies, still kept her shanty. She hadn't taken a cent from Asa and didn't intend to. Whatever this arrangement was, it lived on the narrow ground between charity and choice, and she meant to keep her footing. At the general store, 2 women she recognized from church went quiet when she walked in. The kind of quiet that's louder than shouting. Mrs. Harlan stood behind the counter, arranging ribbon spools with the careful precision of a woman preparing a stage. "Why, good morning. Opal." That sweet knife-edge smile. "Must be nice, having a rich man's table every evening. Some of us make do with our own cooking." The words landed like a slap across a table. Opal felt heat climb her neck, her cheeks, the tips of her ears. Her hands tightened on the coins in her pocket, 14 cents. A full day's washing, the sum total of her worth in this woman's eyes. She bought her soap without speaking and walked out with her back straight and her jaw set and her eyes burning in the February wind. On the road back, she stopped, looked toward the Whitfield ranch, looked toward her shanty. Maybe the women were right. Maybe she was foolish for thinking a man like Asa Whitfield wanted nothing but her company. Maybe she should stop going before the whispers got any louder and any closer to the truth. Whatever the truth was. She went to the ranch anyway. In the barn. Young Jesse was struggling with a newborn calf that wouldn't nurse. He was pulling at the mother, pushing the calf, getting more frustrated by the second. His hat was off, and his hair was in his eyes, and his jaw was clenched the way young men clench their jaws when the world won't cooperate. "Damn thing won't take," he muttered. Opal knelt beside him in the straw. "Easy now. You're scaring both of 'em." She guided his hand slower, gentler, showed him how to hold the calf's head without gripping, how to let it find the teat on its own time. "My mama used to say patience ain't weakness, Jesse, and she raised 6 of us on 40 acres of hard clay, so I reckon she knew what she was talking about." The calf latched. Jesse's face broke into a grin, so wide it cracked the frustration clean off. "Well, how'd you know that?" "Same way I know anything. Somebody had to teach me gentle once, too." Here's what the gossips in town never understood. Opal wasn't taking from Asa's table. She was filling it. In the kitchen that afternoon, Dolores pressed a jar of preserved peaches into Opal's hands. "For you," she said firmly. "Not for the dogs. For you. You eat. Comprende." Opal looked at the jar, golden and heavy in her cracked hands. "Dolores, I can't. You can. You will." Dolores patted her cheek. "Stubborn women need someone more stubborn. That is me." And that evening, back at her shanty, Opal noticed the woodpile beside her door had grown. Fresh, split pine, stacked neat and high, the smell of sap still sharp in the cold air. She hadn't ordered it, couldn't afford it. She stood there looking at that wood and felt something complicated move through her chest. Gratitude knotted up with the old fear that every gift comes with a string attached. Her stove burned warmer that night. She ate the peaches standing at her window, watching the dark, letting the sweetness sit on her tongue. She set out scraps for the strays and whispered to the little black dog, "At least you don't judge where I eat supper." The blizzard came without warning on a Thursday. 1 hour the sky was pewter gray and still. The next, Wind came screaming down from the Bradshaw Mountains like something unleashed, driving snow so thick and sideways that a man couldn't see his own hand at arm's length. Temperature dropped 20 degrees before anybody could get a coat on. The sound of it was enormous, not just wind, but a roar. A wall of noise that swallowed the barn, the house, the valley whole. Opal was at the ranch when it hit. She'd been in the barn with Button and 3 other calves too young to survive a night like this without help. The hands scrambled. Horses needed blanketing. Water troughs would freeze solid. The chicken coop roof was already groaning under the weight of wet snow piling fast. Nobody told Opal what to do. Nobody had to. She organized the barn like a general who'd learned command not from books, but from necessity. Quiet but firm, her voice cutting through the wind, not because she raised it, but because she steadied it. "Jesse, get every blanket from the bunkhouse. I don't care if the hands shiver. These calves die without warmth. Martin, hay bales against the north wall, tight as you can stack 'em. Coop, we need every lantern lit. Body heat and light, that's what keeps 'em breathing." The hands moved. Not one of them hesitated. Not once. She stayed through the night, sat in the straw with calves pressed against her on both sides, singing low old hymns her mother had sung over washtubs, half-remembered lullabies with no words left, just melody rising and falling like breathing. The wind shrieked against the barn walls. The lantern flames bent and steadied and bent again. The smell of hay and warm animal and kerosene filled the darkness, and Opal's voice held it all together like thread through a needle. Come dawn, the wind died. Asa pushed through drifts hip deep to reach the barn and found her. She was asleep, sitting up, hay in her hair, Button alive in her lap. 4 calves breathed steady around her. Her head dipped forward and jerked back and dipped again, the exhausted rhythm of a body that had refused to quit until it simply couldn't stay awake. Her hands, folded over Button's neck, were blue with cold. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She stirred, blinked up at him with eyes that took a moment to focus. "You stayed all night," he said. "They needed somebody. So do you. Opal." She didn't answer that. She looked down at Button and stroked the calf's ear and said nothing. That afternoon, the town pastor rode out to the ranch. Reverend Caldwell was a thin man with thin lips and a voice that made concern sound like a verdict being read. He found Asa on the porch and spoke carefully about appearances, about a woman spending nights at a bachelor's ranch, about what the congregation was saying and what decency required. Asa's hands closed into fists at his sides. He took one step toward the door, stopped himself, and breathed out slow through his nose. "I appreciate you riding out, Reverend. I do." Caldwell waited for more. More didn't come. "Now, I want you to think about what that preacher was really saying and what it cost a proud man like Asa to hold his tongue instead of showing that reverend the road." That night, Asa sat alone before his fireplace. It was enormous riverstone, floor to ceiling, built to heat a house meant for a family of 10. Clara had wanted it that way. She'd imagined children filling these rooms, laughter bouncing off these walls, the smell of baking bread and wet boots and all the noise a full life makes. Instead, there was just Asa, and the fire roared and crackled for nobody. throwing heat into empty rooms like a sermon preached to vacant pews. He stared into the flames and thought about Opal's stove. That sorry little thing, coughing smoke, barely warming a room small enough to cross in 3 steps. And yet she'd divided her supper. She'd knelt in the snow. She'd given warmth away when she had almost none to spare. She'd sat up all night in a freezing barn singing to calves because they needed somebody, and she was the kind of person who answered that call without being asked. The cold hearth wasn't hers. He stood up from the chair, crossed the room and pressed his palm flat against the hearthstone, feeling the heat that blazed against his skin and meant nothing. All this wood, all this flame, all this heat pouring into a house with no heart in it. His was the cold hearth. Had been for 2 years, maybe longer, maybe since before Clara died. If he was honest, maybe since the day he'd decided that building something big was the same as building something good. He thought about the pastor's words, about the town's whispers, about whether he was helping Opal or whether the truth was simpler and more terrifying than that. He thought about how the bunkhouse smelled like sage now, how Jessie said please and thank you at meals and held calves like they were made of glass, how Dolores hummed in the kitchen again, the way she used to when Clara was alive, how even old Coop had taken to nodding at Opal each morning like she was the foreman and he was the hand. She'd brought something into this house that money couldn't build and fire couldn't warm. And now, because of gossip and a thin-lipped preacher and a town too small to mind its own business, she was going to take it away. He found the note on the kitchen table at dawn. The handwriting was careful, the letters shaped with the deliberate effort of someone who'd learned late and practiced hard. Each word sat separate from the next, like she'd thought about everyone before committing it to paper. Thank you for everything. I won't trouble you no more. He read it twice. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. And the third time was when it hit him not like a fist, but like a door swinging open onto a room he'd been afraid to enter. Here's what Asa never said out loud to anyone. He wasn't afraid of what the town thought. He was afraid of what he felt. Afraid that this woman with her cracked hands and her tin can flowers and her voice that could calm a panicked horse had walked into his cold, expensive house and made it a home, and that without her, it would go right back to being exactly what it was: stone and timber and fire, a hearth with no heart. He folded the note and put it in his vest pocket, put on his hat, walked to the stable in the dark, the snow crunching under his boots, the smell of frozen pine sharp as a blade. He saddled his horse and rode toward town before the sun came up. He found her kneeling in the snow, same posture, same place, same shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the February cold. The 3 strays circled her, the brown mutt, the skinny hound, the little black one eating scraps she'd divided from whatever she'd managed to scrape together. The barn cats watched from under the shanty steps. Her breath rose in thin clouds, and her hands shook from cold, or hunger, or both, as she set the dish down. The image stopped him like a hand on his chest. He'd seen this exact scene 3 weeks ago from horseback, a stranger passing through. Now he saw it with eyes that knew her. He saw a woman who would give away her last bite to a creature that couldn't thank her, couldn't pay her back, couldn't do a single thing for her except be hungry and need help. And he understood, dismounting in the road with the leather creaking and his breath clouding in the cold. That this was not weakness. This was the strongest thing he had ever witnessed in his life. Stronger than cattle empires and stone fireplaces and all the money in the territory. He walked to her. She looked up, and he saw that she'd been crying, though her face was composed now, her chin steady, her dignity pulled around her tight as that shawl. "I ain't got nothing to give a man like you, Mr. Whitfield." Her voice was even. "I appreciate what you done, but I won't have folks talking about you on my account." Asa took off his hat. He looked at the dogs. He looked at her. Then he crouched down in the snow beside her, eye to eye, close enough to see the cracked skin on her knuckles and the dried tear tracks the wind hadn't quite erased. "I got something to say. Opal, and I'd be obliged if you'd hear it." He paused. Let the quiet settle. "3 weeks ago, you was a stranger feeding strays, and I was a rich man with an empty house. I thought I was doing you a kindness, but you're the one who filled that house up. You made it a home, Opal. Ain't nobody done that since Clara passed. People will talk. People always talk. Don't make 'em right." She looked at him for a long time. The snow fell soft between them, catching on her hair, on his shoulders, on the backs of the dogs who had stopped eating to watch. The little black one nosed at Asa's knee, and he let it. "I ain't asking you back out of pity," he said. "I'm asking because you belong there." Opal's chin trembled. She looked down at the bread in her hand, then at the dogs, then at this man kneeling in the snow beside her like he had nowhere better to be in the world. "Well," she said quietly, "help me feed these dogs first." Asa took the bread. He broke it into pieces and set them in the snow. One by one, careful as planting seeds, and the little black dog ate from his hand for the first time. Valentine's Day came to Prescott the way most days did that winter cold. Quiet, without ceremony. Frost still coated the fence posts. Snow still lay across the valley in sheets of white and blue. The sky was the same pale February sky it had been for weeks, offering nothing but cold light and the distant promise that somewhere, eventually, spring was thinking about showing up. But at the Whitfield ranch, something had changed that no calendar could account for. Jesse Pruitt had found crocuses that morning, purple and white, pushing up through the snow behind the barn where the south wall caught the sun and held a little warmth against the stone. He'd cut them careful with his pocket knife, gentle now, the way Opal had taught him to be, and put them in the tin can on the bunkhouse windowsill, right next to the dried sage sprigs, real flowers now, alive and stubborn, blooming in February because nobody had told them they couldn't. Button had grown fat and bold, nudging anyone who stood still long enough for a scratch behind the ears. The 4 calves Opal had nursed through the blizzard were thriving leggy and bright-eyed, following her across the yard like ducklings. By the barn, a new shelter stood rough-cut pine, nothing fancy, with a hay floor and a sloped roof and the smell of fresh sawdust still clinging to the boards. Asa had built it with his own hands for the stray dogs that had followed Opal up from town. The little black one slept there every night now, warm for the first time in its short, hard life. Dolores had made a cake. Nobody had asked her to. She'd simply appeared that morning with flour on her apron and a look that dared anyone to comment. And by afternoon, the kitchen smelled like vanilla and brown sugar and something that felt suspiciously like celebration. Opal stood on the porch that evening, watching dusk settle over the valley. Same blue-gray light as that first February evening. Same snow on the ground. Same cold sharpening the edges of everything. The strays gathered at the porch steps, the brown mutt. The hound. The little black one with its tail going. The barn cats sat at their dignified distance. Button lowed softly from the corral. Asa came out and stood beside her. He was quiet for a while, the way men are when they've got something important to say and want to get it right. The coffee in his hand steamed. The last light caught the snow on the far ridge and turned it gold. "I've been thinking about that first evening," he said. "When I seen you in the snow with them dogs, I told you that you had the richest heart in the territory, and I meant it, but I didn't understand it yet." He turned to her. "You showed me that generosity ain't about how much you got. It's about how much you're willing to give. I had everything, Opal, and I wasn't given a thing that mattered." She shook her head slowly. "You gave me a place at your table. You gave me a reason to set it." Inside, the hearth blazed, not the roaring, wasteful fire of a man heating empty rooms, but a steady warmth tended, purposeful, alive with the sound of Dolores clattering dishes and Jessie's boots on the mudroom floor and all the small noises a home makes when it's finally full. Opal set a plate of scraps on the porch rail. Good scraps now. Real food, because there was enough. The little black dog, the same one who'd shivered at her shanty door 3 weeks ago, ate first. Its tail moved slow and sure, the way it does when an animal has learned that the hand reaching toward it means kindness and not a kick. She watched the February stars appear, one by one, over a valley that looked exactly the same as it always had, and was somehow entirely different. The cold was still there. It would always be there, this time of year. But it didn't reach her anymore. And if you ever wonder what the truest wealth looks like, I'll tell you. It looks like a woman in the snow, sharing her last bite with something that can't thank her. It looks like a man who stops his horse and takes off his hat. It looks like a table with room enough, and a heart brave enough to fill it. That's the richest heart in any territory, and it always will be.